All right, we're back with another deep dive, and let me tell you, this one's a doozy. So you guys know that Vance/Walz VP debate, the one everybody's been dissecting. Well, you asked us to really get in there, read between the lines, and let me tell you.
Buckle up.
Right. This transcript is explosive, to say the least.
It's one for the history books. I mean, VP debates, they're often overlooked, right? But this one was a gold mine. Foreign policy showdowns, climate change clashes, even some deep dives into the candidates' pasts.
Oh, we're going there. Because, I mean, think about it. Iran decides to launch its biggest attack yet on Israel just hours before the debate kicks off. Talk about setting the stage. Hurricane Helene is out there like a giant told yes so about climate change.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up.
Not to mention a major labor strike throws even more uncertainty into the mix. It's like the whole world was watching.
And it may be holding its breath a little. I know I was.
For good reason, right? I mean, let's be real. A lot of people were on edge about what we'd see from Vance in particular. His connection to, well, you know.
The elephant, or should I say elephant shadow, looming over the whole thing.
Right. So Vance, who, by the way, comes from a working class background, served in the military, tries to distance himself from that whole out-of-touch politician image.
Yeah.
He even went so far as to claim that the Trump presidency was a time of global stability.
Peace through strength was his go-to phrase. Used it like 4 times, I swear. And look, it's a powerful message. It taps into this deep desire for, well, strong leadership on the world stage, you know, especially with things as tense as they are globally.
Yeah, but was it really so peaceful? I mean, come on.
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting because Vance is clearly trying to control the narrative. He's painting this picture of a strong, decisive leader who brought stability to the world stage. But then you have Walz, who keeps bringing up specific examples like, you know, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal.
Which was supposed to, like, prevent Iran from getting nukes, right?
Exactly. So Walz uses those examples to poke holes in Vance's narrative. He even goes so far as to accuse him of pushing revisionist history, which is a pretty bold move in a debate.
Makes you wonder who to believe, right?
Right. It plants that seed of doubt. It makes you question, is Vance being deliberately misleading, or has he actually changed his tune?
Which I guess we'll get to later, right?
Oh, we'll get there. And it gets even juicier, trust me.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we get to that bombshell, let's talk about another one. Climate change. Vance says he's all about clean air, clean water, which, duh, who isn't? But his big solution seems to be bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. Like, that's going to solve everything.
It's more complicated than that. He's tapping into this economic anxiety that a lot of voters are feeling, the idea that jobs have been lost to, you know, globalization and all that. And he's tying it to environmental policy, which is a smart strategy.
But he also throws some serious shade at the whole carbon emissions thing, right?
Yeah, he expresses some skepticism about carbon emissions being the main driver of climate change. And this is where you see that stark contrast with Walz, who represents a state with a huge agricultural sector.
So he's heard it all from the farmers, I bet.
Exactly. He kept bringing up his experience representing farmers who are seeing the very real effects of climate change. Droughts, floods, messed up growing seasons.
And those farmers probably don't appreciate being called drug mules. Which brings us to our next powder keg, immigration.
Buckle up, because this is where the debate really heats up. Vance comes out swinging, highlighting the border crisis, and pledging to enact the biggest mass deportation plan in U.S. history.
With military, no less. But the most explosive part for me was when they got to family separation.
Oof, yeah.
Because Vance, he straight up says, and I quote, "The real family separation policy in this country is Kamala Harris's wide-open southern border."
Talk about a power play. He's shifting the blame, tapping into those anxieties about border security. It's a bold strategy, and you can bet it got people fired up on both sides.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And of course, Walz was quick to point out the hypocrisy there, reminding everyone about what went down during the previous administration.
Right. He calls Vance out on that, but he also tries to steer the conversation toward a more, more humane approach. He talks about comprehensive immigration reform, the need for bipartisan cooperation.
Which, let's be real, seems kind of impossible these days.
Yeah, it's a tall order in the current political climate, but hey, at least he's talking about it.
And speaking of things that seem impossible, let's talk about the one thing that keeps most people up at night: the economy.
It's the #1 issue for most voters.
Right.
And the two candidates couldn't be more different in their approaches.
Talk about a contrast. You've got Harris-Lossells. They're all about tax credits, investments in clean energy, infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
the classic playbook.
Yeah, it's a very traditional kind of Keynesian approach, right? The government steps in, boosts spending to get things moving, create some jobs.
Sounds good in theory, but who's going to pay for all that?
Yeah.
Especially with the deficit already giving everyone heartburn.
That's the million-dollar question, and that's where these economic debates often go off the rails. The Wharton School, by the way, Vance's alma mater, they projected a $1.2 trillion increase in the deficit under Harris-Walz.
Ouch.
Yeah, those numbers are nothing to sneeze at. But here's the thing, those projections, they're all based on models, assumptions, What they don't always capture is the long game. Meaning investments in things like education, infrastructure, clean energy. Those can actually pay off down the line, boost economic growth, which means more tax revenue.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as spending bad, tax cuts good.
Okay, so there's nuance. Got it. But still, $1.2 trillion, that's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you compare it to the $5.8 trillion increase projected under Trump/Vance. How'd they even get to that number?
Well, their plan leans heavily on deregulation, tax cuts, particularly for corporations and the wealthy, and that whole reshoring idea we talked about.
Bring those jobs back home.
Yeah.
But does that actually work?
That's the billion-dollar question. And honestly, the jury's still out. Some economists will tell you, yes, it's a surefire way to boost the economy. Others, not so much.
So basically they're asking voters to take a gamble.
Pretty much. But hey, gotta give Walz credit for this one singer. It still cracks me up. If you need heart surgery, listen to the people at the Mayo Clinic, not Donald Trump.
Oof. Shots fired.
Right. And it perfectly encapsulates this tension we've been talking about, lived experience versus expert analysis. Who do you trust?
And speaking of trust, things got very, shall we say, personal when the debate turned to the candidates' pasts.
Ah, yes, because at the end of the day, it's not just about policies, is it? It's about character, judgment. Can we trust this person with the nuclear codes?
Heavy stuff. So let's start with those inconsistencies in Walz's story about, his travels during Tiananmen Square. Seemed like a small detail.
But in politics, there are no small details. It plays into that gotcha mentality, right? Raises questions about credibility, whether it was a genuine mistake or something more.
Well, Vance definitely tried to spin it as something more.
Wouldn't you? Especially given his own, shall we say, colorful history of comments. I mean, we can't just ignore that whole America's Hitler thing he said about Trump a while back.
Yeah, that's not exactly a skeleton you could just shift back in the closet.
Exactly. It really gets to the heart of this question of authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Has Vance genuinely evolved in his thinking, or is this just a calculated move to get ahead?
Especially with those leaked messages popping up right before the debate, where he's contradicting everything he's saying now. Awkward.
The timing of those leaks was suspect, to say the least. But it's fascinating how Vance tries to navigate that whole mess. He owns up to his past criticism, but then tries to spin it as evidence of his willingness to learn, to grow.
Risky move.
Very risky. But it might just work, especially with voters who are tired of the same old partisan BS.
Maybe. But then he goes and proposes mass deportations. Talk about mixed messages.
It's a tough needle to thread. He's trying to appeal to the Trump base, but also come across as, a reasonable, electable candidate.
It's like walking a tightrope blindfolded during an earthquake.
Pretty much. And all of that is before we even get to one of the most volatile, most deeply personal issues in American politics, reproductive rights. It's one of those issues where, there's just so much at stake on a personal level, on a societal level. And you saw that passion from both candidates. Walz was, he was fired up, defending Minnesota's abortion law, which is pretty progressive, calling it a matter of freedom of bodily autonomy.
Which puts him at odds with, most of the Republican Party, right?
Yeah, and Vance stuck to the script there. States' rights, each state should decide for itself. It's been the GOP line for decades.
But they both tried to bring it back to the whole family values thing, didn't they? Like, we both support families. We want what's best for women and children.
It's the how. That's always the sticking point, right? And Vance was pretty light on specifics, especially when it came to actually supporting those families. Like that whole $5,000 child tax credit Trump proposed.
Crickets.
Exactly. It's easy to talk a big game, but the devil's in the details.
For sure. And speaking of details, or rather the lack thereof, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, the thing that's been casting a shadow over this entire election. The state of American democracy, because that's where things got real.
No kidding. I mean, we're talking at the very foundation of our country, right? Election integrity, the peaceful transfer of power. And Walz just goes straight for it, calls out Vance on that whole wouldn't have certified the 2020 election comment.
I actually got chills when he said that. And then he hits him with this line, so something out of a movie. He says, "I don't think we can be the frog in the pot and let the boiling water go up."
Talk about a visual. He's talking about the slow creep of authoritarianism, right? How we can become desensitized to extremism until it's too late.
So what's Vance's response to that? He just blames the Democrats?
Pretty much. Brings up Hillary Clinton, Russian interference in 2016. That whole both sides argument.
Which, come on.
Yeah.
That's comparing apples and oranges. And then Walz, the way he ends that segment, it's just, he looks Vance dead in the eye and asks, where is the firewall with Donald Trump?
Mic drop. I mean, that question just hangs there, right? It's
Yeah.
like he's speaking to the soul of America or something.
Okay, so after all that, any hope for, kumbaya?
Well, they both tried to end on a positive note. Talked about shared values, civility, blah, blah, blah.
But let's be real. Their visions for the future are like night and day.
No doubt about it. And that's the choice we're facing, isn't it? Two very different paths, both with huge implications for the future.
Well, there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into the Vance Walz VP debate. We covered a lot of ground, from foreign policy to climate change to, well, the fate of democracy itself.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is that this election, it's about more than just policies. It's about who we are as a country, what we value, what we're willing to fight for.
So do your homework, people. Read everything, listen to everyone, and for goodness sake, get out there and vote.
Couldn't have said it better myself.